In our top story tonight, explosive accusations are being made against former U.S. President George W. Bush. These allegations are being made for the first time by a former senior member of the Bush administration, saying Bush and his cronies, then Vice President Dick Cheney and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, knew hundreds of innocent men were being sent to Guantanamo Bay prison, and they covered it up. Why? Well, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson alleges Bush feared releasing these detainees would harm the push for war in Iraq and the larger war on terror. Joining me now to talk about it is Brian Becker, National Coordinator of the Answer Coalition. I want to thank you for being here. Now, we've heard these kind of statements come out before from perhaps analysts or experts, but to have Wilkerson, who was Chief of Staff for Colin Powell during the Bush administration, Colin Powell, of course, was running the State Department at the time. How significant is this? What is this saying that, you know, he's alleging the top echelons in the administration knew these innocent men were being taken to Guantanamo Bay and covered it up?
Well, I think the signed affidavit by Colonel Wilkerson, he was a colonel in the U.S. military in addition to being Colin Powell's chief of staff at the State Department, should be considered to be the most explosive of all, because it says under oath that George Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld knowingly kept hundreds of innocent people who were not subject to any sort of rightful internment at Guantanamo, a center that the United Nations itself identified as a torture center. So that means that Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld knowingly kept innocent people who had done nothing against the United States, had never, as Colonel Wilkerson says in his affidavit, never even seen a U.S. soldier anywhere in combat or anywhere else, kept them in a center that's been identified as a place where human beings were tortured. I think this should give tremendous impetus to the movement that's been somewhat subterranean right now, but should come out for the prosecution and indictment of George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, and all of those for criminal acts. Just because you're president or vice president or secretary of defense does not mean that you're immune from prosecution.
Well, what do you make of the justification that Wilkerson gave, that they were saying that they believe the imprisonment of innocent men justified possibly getting some genuine militants that helped the broader war on terror for the U.S.?
Well, not only that, but he also said that, as you mentioned in your setup piece, that this was designed to bolster the case for war. Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld were rushing towards war. If they had released these detainees and said, well, in fact, they're innocent, and those detainees came out and said, we've been tortured, the whole credibility of the Bush administration would have shattered at the moment that they were trying to build a consensus for a war that should have never happened, a war of aggression. And if you look back at where people were waterboarded, they were waterboarded at different times, 80 times, 100 times, 163 times, also trying to elicit information from them that would say that there was some al-Qaeda connection to Saddam Hussein. In other words, everything at that time was being justified as the rationale for bolstering the war effort.
Okay, speaking of al-Qaeda, I want to talk about if it's true, as Wilkerson has said in this affidavit, that the majority of the 742 detainees sent to Gitmo in 2002 were in fact innocent. What consequences has that had? Have these captures of innocent people radicalized them, radicalized others, and basically created a lot of the militancy the U.S. is fighting today, do you think?
Well, I think it must. I mean, you cannot torture people, hold them without due process, rip them away from their families. We're talking about people as young as 12 and as old as 93 years old, were some of the majority of so-called innocent people that Wilkerson identifies. You can't do that to human beings and not generate bitterness, anger, hatred, not only by them, but from their families and their neighbors. And just as we see in the ongoing occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan, when you occupy people, when you treat them badly, you generate fierce resistance, because that's the human nature.
Okay, I want to talk about now. You know, Gitmo was set up so quickly when it was a swift decision, but now, I mean, it's not the Bush administration, it's the Obama administration, and he's been saying for over a year he was going to close it. Why is it so difficult to entangle? What is the holdup, especially now that we know and have evidence that many of these people may, in fact, be innocent?
Well, you have countervailing pressures on the Obama administration. Of course, there are conservative Republicans and others who are saying if you release these people from Guantanamo, then they have to come to U.S. federal prisons, and that creates a security danger. I don't think that's the real issue. I think what happens is if you bring people out of the torture center, out of Guantanamo, and you put them in federal courts, if in fact the government has evidence, then they have rights. They have the right to come forward and say, as these hundreds of individuals did not have the right, I am innocent, I have been wrongly arrested, and I must be set free. The Obama administration has been confronted now with the reality of being the chief executive, not just of the country, but of the military-industrial complex, and he doesn't want to buck the tide, apparently. His first act when he came into office was he'd close Guantanamo. Here we are 15 months later, Guantanamo's still open.
So it sounds like maybe you're arguing it's a politically impossible situation to release them, much as it sounded like, or it's been alleged, that the Bush administration said many years ago. Thank you so much for weighing in.
Thank you.